In 1933, a woman working in a garment factory in New York City earned $4 a week. Not $4 an hour, $4 a week, for 48 hours of work, less than 9 cents an hour. She was not an outlier, she was typical. In the depths of the Great Depression, wages across American industry had collapsed to levels that made survival a daily calculation. $1 a day was considered reasonable pay in many industries. In the South, textile workers earned as little as 5 cents an hour. In agricultural work, the wages were often lower still, and all of it was entirely legal. There was no federal law setting a floor on what an employer could pay a worker. There was no minimum wage. An employer could pay whatever the market would bear, and in a labor market with 25% unemployment, the market would bear almost nothing. The Fair Labor Standards Act, signed by Franklin Roosevelt on June 25, 1938, established the first federal minimum wage in American history, 25 cents an hour. It covered roughly 11 million workers. It did not cover agricultural workers, domestic workers, or most service workers, which meant it did not cover the majority of black workers in the South, and it was immediately attacked by business groups as the beginning of the end of American capitalism. The minimum wage in 2025 is $7.25 per hour at the federal level, unchanged since 2009, the longest period without a federal minimum wage increase in the law's history. Adjusted for inflation, it is worth less than the minimum wage of 1968. The argument about whether there should be a minimum wage at all, whether it helps or hurts the workers it is supposed to protect, has been going on since before the law was passed, and it has not been resolved. This is the story of what American workers actually earned before the minimum wage existed, of the political battle that produced the first federal wage floor, of the specific compromises that shaped it and the specific workers it left out, and of the ongoing argument about what the minimum wage is for and whether it is working. To understand what wages looked like before the minimum wage, you need to understand the labor market of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and specifically the power relationship between employers and workers in an economy with no floor on compensation. The classical economic theory that dominated American thinking about wages through most of the 19th century held that wages were determined by supply and demand in the labor market, and that any interference with this market mechanism would produce worse outcomes than the market would produce on its own. If wages were too low, workers would leave for better-paying employers, and competition for workers would drive wages up. If wages were artificially set above the market rate, employers would hire fewer workers, and unemployment would result. This theory was not entirely wrong. In a labor market with full employment and mobile workers, competition among employers for workers does tend to push wages toward the level at which workers can sustain themselves. The problem was that the American labor market of the late 19th and early 20th centuries did not consistently resemble the competitive market of classical economic theory. Several features of the actual labor market systematically depressed wages below the level that a competitive market would have produced. The first was unemployment. An economy with significant unemployment, as the American economy experienced repeatedly in the financial panics of 1873, 1893, and 1907, and in the catastrophic depression of the 1930s, has workers who are desperate enough to accept wages below subsistence because the alternative is no income at all. The threat of unemployment, real and present, kept workers from demanding higher wages even when higher wages were economically feasible for employers. The second was immobility. Workers who lived in company towns, who were employed by the dominant employer in a geographic area, or who lacked the resources to relocate could not simply leave for better-paying employers. A coal miner in a West Virginia company town in 1900 was not choosing between competing employers in a competitive market. He was choosing between the one employer available to him and unemployment. The market theory's assumption of worker mobility did not apply to his situation. The third was the absence of information. Workers frequently did not know what other employers were paying for comparable work, because wages were not publicly disclosed, because workers in different establishments rarely communicated with each other, and because the information asymmetry between employers and workers was substantial. An employer who knew exactly what workers in other establishments were earning, because employers discussed wages with each other through trade associations and informal networks, could offer wages just below the market rate without workers knowing the difference. The fourth was discrimination. Black workers, immigrant workers, and women workers faced discrimination that reduced their wages below what white male workers received for comparable work, and that made the threat of replacement by discriminated against workers a tool that employers could use to keep wages low across all groups. If a black worker would accept half the wage that a white worker demanded, and if the employer could hire either, then the presence of discriminated against workers in the labor market reduced the bargaining power of all workers. These features of the actual labor market combined to produce wages in many industries that were far below what a genuinely competitive market would have produced and far below what workers needed to survive. The documentation of actual wages in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, conducted by state labor bureaus and federal investigators who visited workplaces and surveyed workers, found poverty at a scale that contradicted the classical economic narrative about markets producing adequate wages for those willing to work. A Massachusetts Bureau of Labor Statistics report from 1883 found that more than a third of the state's industrial workers earned wages insufficient to meet basic living expenses. The report documented families in which multiple members worked full-time and still could not afford adequate food, clothing, and housing. The workers were not lacking in willingness to work. They were lacking in wages sufficient to live on. The Bureau of Labor Investigation of Conditions in the Steel Industry, conducted in 1910, found that the majority of unskilled workers in the Pittsburgh steel mills earned less than $1.65 a day, the amount the investigators estimated was required for a minimum standard of living for a single worker with no dependents. Workers with families were earning wages that made adequate nutrition and housing impossible unless other family members also worked, which meant children working rather than attending school and women working in addition to managing households. The garment industry provided some of the most detailed documentation of inadequate wages because it was concentrated in urban areas where investigators could easily access workers, and because the labor movement in the garment industry was strong enough to generate political pressure for investigation. The 1911 investigation of the New York garment industry found women workers earning as little as $2.50 per week for full-time work in an industry dominated by piece rate payment that transferred the risk of slow production from the employer to the worker. The piece rate system, which paid workers by the unit of production rather than by the hour, was widespread in manufacturing and had specific effects on wages and working conditions. Workers paid by the piece had an incentive to work as fast as possible, which drove up the pace of production across the workplace and created conditions in which earnings depended on maintaining a pace that was physically exhausting and that left workers vulnerable to injuries from rushing. Employers who observed that workers could earn more than a certain amount at the current piece rate would lower the rate, ensuring that wages remained controlled even as productivity increased. The rate-cutting practice was a systematic feature of piece rate industries and was a primary grievance of workers in those industries. A worker who invested in developing the skill and speed to earn a decent wage under the current piece rate would find the rate cut when the employer observed the higher earnings, returning the wage to the level the employer considered appropriate. The incentive to develop skill was undermined by the certainty that the returns to that skill would be captured by the employer rather than retained by the worker. The Great Depression collapsed wages to levels that made even the inadequate wages of the pre-Depression era seem relatively comfortable. The unemployment rate reached 25% by 1933. Among those who remained employed, wages fell as employers cut pay, knowing that the unemployed would accept any wage rather than none. Industries that had paid wages of $1 to $2 a day before the Depression were paying 50 cents or less. The garment industry worker earning $4 a week at the beginning of this story was earning poverty wages by any measure, but she was employed. Millions of her contemporaries were not. The political response to the Depression's wage collapse included the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933, which authorized industries to develop codes of fair competition that included minimum wage and maximum hour standards. The NRA codes established industry-specific minimum wages that range from $12 to $15 per week in most covered industries, a dramatic increase from the wages actually being paid in many workplaces at the time. The NRA codes were the first experience of federal wage standards in American history, and the experience was instructive in ways that influenced the design of the Fair Labor Standards Act that followed. The codes showed that minimum wage standards were administratively feasible, that most employers could absorb them without going out of business, and that workers benefited from them in ways that were visible and measurable. They also showed the political resistance that wage standards generated from employers who had built their business models around low wages, and the specific political power of Southern employers who insisted that minimum wages be set below levels that would significantly affect their operations. The Supreme Court struck down the NRA in 1935 in Schechter Poultry Corp. Verden, United States, ruling that Congress had unconstitutionally delegated legislative authority to private industry codes. The NRA's wage standards disappeared with it. The political project of establishing federal wage standards had to start over. Roosevelt proposed the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1937. The bill was immediately attacked from several directions. Conservative Republicans and Southern Democrats argued that federal wage standards were unconstitutional, an interference with the state's authority to regulate labor conditions. Business groups argued that a federal minimum wage would destroy jobs by forcing employers to pay more than low productivity workers were worth. Southern employers were particularly aggressive in their opposition, knowing that a minimum wage set at a meaningful level would dramatically raise wages in the South, where wages were far below the national average. The Southern opposition was the most politically significant because Southern Democrats were essential members of the New Deal coalition, without whose votes the bill could not pass. The compromise that produced the final bill reflected Southern political power in ways that are directly analogous to the racial compromises that shaped Social Security and other New Deal legislation. The compromise had several components. First, the initial minimum wage was set at 25 cents per hour, a level that was meaningful in the North, but that still left Southern wages significantly below Northern wages because the 25-cent floor was below the prevailing wage in some Southern industries. Second, agricultural workers and domestic workers were excluded from coverage, the same exclusions that had been made in Social Security, and for the same political reason. These were the occupations that employed the largest share of black workers in the South, and Southern Democrats would not accept a minimum wage that applied to them. The exclusions were not incidental compromises. They were the price of Southern support, and they were understood by all parties as racial compromises. A minimum wage that did not apply to the workers who were most severely exploited in the South, because those workers were black, was a minimum wage that served the political interests of the Southern employers whose exploitation was being accommodated. The racial dimension of the minimum wage exclusions has had lasting consequences. The workers excluded in 1938, agricultural workers and domestic workers, were the workers with the lowest wages, the least bargaining power, and the greatest need for the floor that the minimum wage provided. Their exclusion meant that the minimum wage's benefits in its early years were concentrated among white workers in manufacturing and commerce, while the black workers who were most in need of wage protection were left out. Agricultural workers were brought partially under minimum wage coverage by the 1966 amendments to the Fair Labor Standards Act, which established a minimum wage for agricultural workers that was lower than the standard minimum wage. Domestic workers were not brought under coverage until 1974. These expansions were meaningful improvements, but the wages in these sectors have historically remained lower than in sectors that were covered from the beginning, reflecting both the lower coverage standards and the legacy of exclusion. The arguments that were made against the minimum wage in 1938 have been made against every subsequent increase in the minimum wage since then. The argument that a higher minimum wage will reduce employment by making low-wage workers too expensive for employers to hire is the central economic argument against minimum wage increases, and it has been debated with increasing empirical sophistication over the decades since the minimum wage was established. The empirical evidence on the employment effects of minimum wage increases is more complicated than either its proponents or its opponents have often suggested. The simple supply and demand model that predicts significant job loss from minimum wage increases has not been consistently confirmed by the actual experience of minimum wage increases. Studies comparing employment in states that raised their minimum wage with neighboring states that did not have found that the employment effects were typically small and sometimes positive, suggesting that the simple model overstates the job loss from minimum wage increases. The research of economists David Card and Alan Kruger in the early 1990s, which compared employment in fast food restaurants in New Jersey after a minimum wage increase with fast food restaurants in neighboring Pennsylvania, which had not raised its minimum wage, found no significant negative employment effect from the New Jersey increase. This finding was controversial at the time and has been replicated, contested, and refined in hundreds of subsequent studies. The current consensus in empirical labor economics is that moderate minimum wage increases have small and uncertain employment effects, with some studies finding slight reductions and others finding no significant effect or even slight increases. The mechanism by which minimum wage increases can avoid the job losses that the simple model predicts has been identified in the economic literature on monopsony, the market condition in which employers have market power over workers, analogous to the market power that monopolists have over consumers. In a monopsonistic labor market, employers can pay workers less than the competitive wage because workers have limited alternatives. In this setting, a minimum wage that raises wages toward the competitive level can increase both wages and employment simultaneously by correcting the market distortion that the employer's market power had created. The relevance of monopsony to the low-wage labor market is contested, but the research on employer concentration in specific geographic areas and specific industries has found evidence of meaningful employer market power in many low-wage sectors. Fast food, retail, home health care, and other industries that employ large numbers of low-wage workers are often dominated by a small number of large employers in specific geographic markets, giving those employers bargaining power over workers that the simple competitive model does not capture. The question of what the right level for the minimum wage is has no objectively correct answer because it depends on empirical judgments about employment effects that are uncertain and on value judgments about the appropriate balance between workers' wages and employers' flexibility that are contested. What is clear is that the current federal minimum wage of $7.25 per hour has been eroded significantly by inflation over the 16 years since it was last increased. A worker earning the federal minimum wage in 2025 earns less in inflation-adjusted terms than a worker earning the minimum wage in 1968, despite the substantial increase in labor productivity over that period. The divergence between the states that have raised their minimum wages above the federal level and the states that rely on the federal minimum has produced a natural experiment in the effects of minimum wage increases at scale. States like California, Washington, and New York have raised their minimum wages to $15 per hour or higher. States in the South and Midwest have maintained the federal minimum at $7.25. The economic outcomes in these states have not followed the pattern that opponents of minimum wage increases predicted. The high minimum wage states have not experienced the job losses or business closures that were projected, and their low-wage workers are earning significantly more than low-wage workers in states that maintain the federal minimum. This does not prove that any minimum wage level is economically viable. The economic literature suggests that minimum wages set very far above the prevailing market wage can produce significant employment effects. The question is where the tipping point is, and the evidence from state minimum wage increases suggests that it is higher than the simple economic model implies. The political argument about the minimum wage is ultimately not just an economic argument. It is an argument about the relationship between wages and dignity, about whether the labor market's unregulated outcome is an acceptable floor for the compensation of work, and about what role the government should play in ensuring that full-time work provides an income sufficient to meet basic needs. The woman earning $4 a week in the New York garment factory in 1933 was not, in the classical economic framing, being exploited. She was receiving the market wage for her labor, set by the intersection of supply and demand in a labor market with 25% unemployment. The market's answer to the question of what her labor was worth was $4 a week, less than 9 cents an hour. The political argument that produced the Fair Labor Standards Act was that the market's answer was not the right answer, that the government had both the authority and the obligation to establish a floor below which the compensation of labor could not fall, regardless of what the market would produce. That argument succeeded in 1938. 50 years after the first state minimum wage laws were proposed and defeated. The argument continues today. The current federal minimum wage of $7.25 per hour, unchanged since 2009, represents the market's answer to the question of what the government is willing to enforce as the floor. In the states that have set their own floors higher, the answer is different. In the states that rely on the federal minimum, a full-time worker earns approximately $15,000 per year before taxes, below the federal poverty line for a family of two. Whether that is the right answer is the question that the minimum wage debate has been asking since before the law existed. The economic evidence provides some guidance, but does not settle it. The political process, which reflects the balance of power between those who benefit from low wages and those who suffer from them, produces the answer that the current political system is willing to enforce. The woman in the garment factory in 1933 had no minimum wage. The worker earning the federal minimum in 2025 has a floor that is worth less in real terms than the floor that existed in 1968. The progress from no floor to an inadequate floor is real. The distance from an inadequate floor to a floor that actually provides what the law promised, a minimum standard of living for those willing to work, is still being measured. From the $4 week of 1933 to the 25-cent per hour floor of 1938 to the $7.25 floor of 2025 that has not moved in 16 years. That is the history of the minimum wage in America. And the argument about what it should be is as unresolved as it has ever been. Subscribe if this kind of history is what you are here for. There is a great deal more of it ahead. To understand the full weight of what the minimum wage debate is actually about, you need to go back to the specific industries and specific workers whose wages were documented in the decades before the Fair Labor Standards Act. Because the statistics, $4 a week and 9 cents an hour, require context to become real. They require knowing what $4 a week meant in practice, what it bought and what it did not buy, and what the people earning it were doing with their lives while they earned it. A woman earning $4 a week in New York City in 1933 was earning approximately 50 cents per 8-hour day. In that city at that time, a decent room in a boarding house cost $3 to $4 a week. A pound of bread cost 8 cents, a pound of beef cost 20 cents. A subway fare was 5 cents. The $4 weekly wage, if she spent nothing on clothing, entertainment, medical care, or savings, was barely sufficient to cover rent and a minimal food budget for one person. If she had any other expenses, including the cost of getting to work, she was in deficit. This was the situation of millions of American workers in the Depression era, and it was not a new situation created by the Depression. It was a situation that had characterized low-wage work in American industry for decades, made more acute by the Depression's collapse in wages, but not created by it. The investigations of wage levels conducted by state labor bureaus in the 1880s and 1890s had found similar patterns. Wages in many industries that were insufficient to cover basic living expenses even for a single worker with no dependents. The phenomenon that labor economists call the working poor, people who work full-time and remain poor, was not a concept invented in the late 20th century. It was the ordinary condition of a significant fraction of the American labor force for most of the country's industrial history. The minimum wage was designed to address it. The question of whether it has succeeded, and what it would take for it to succeed more fully, is the question that the policy debate has been circling for 87 years. The specific industries that were most affected by the initial minimum wage were those where wages had fallen furthest below subsistence levels during the Depression. The garment industry, the laundry industry, and retail were the sectors where wages were most dramatically inadequate, and they were also the sectors where the workforce was most heavily female and most heavily composed of immigrant workers. This demographic concentration was not coincidental. Women and immigrants faced discrimination in the labor market that reduced their bargaining power and their wages below those of comparable white male workers, and the industries that employed them disproportionately were the industries where wage exploitation was most severe. The garment industry's history is particularly instructive because it is the industry that produced both the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire and the labor organizing that eventually produced the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, one of the most significant labor organizations in American history. The ILGWU's campaigns for better wages and conditions in the garment industry, which began in earnest after the Triangle Fire in 1911, produced the framework of collective bargaining agreements, labor standards, legislation, and political organizing that eventually contributed to the Fair Labor Standards Act. The connection between the labor movement and the minimum wage is fundamental, not incidental. The minimum wage exists because organized labor fought for it, because labor unions understood that without a wage floor, non-union employers could undercut unionized employers by paying less than union wages, which would undermine the entire system of collective bargaining. A minimum wage that covered all employers in an industry removed the competitive advantage that low-wage employers gained from their willingness to pay less than subsistence wages. This connection explains both the labor movement's consistent support for minimum wage increases and the business community's consistent opposition. A higher minimum wage is not simply a transfer of income from employers to workers, though it is that. It is also a leveling of the competitive playing field, which benefits employers who already pay above the minimum by removing the cost advantage that low-wage employers gain from paying less. This is why some business owners, particularly those in high-wage industries who face competition from low-wage industries, have supported minimum wage increases even from a position of self-interest. The business community's opposition to the minimum wage has been consistent but not monolithic. In the 8 decades since the Fair Labor Standards Act, there have been repeated periods when business opposition to minimum wage increases was sufficiently organized and effective to prevent increases for extended periods. The current 16-year period without a federal minimum wage increase is the longest in the law's history, a product of political conditions in which business opposition has been more effective than worker advocacy in determining the outcome. The 16 years since the last federal minimum wage increase in 2009 have seen significant inflation that has eroded the real value of the $7.25 floor. A worker earning the federal minimum in 2025 has a real wage that is worth approximately 30% less than a worker earning the same nominal wage in 2009, because prices have risen while the wage floor has not. In inflation-adjusted terms, the current federal minimum wage is worth less than the 1968 minimum wage, despite the dramatic increase in labor productivity over that period. The productivity gap is the statistic that minimum wage advocates cite most frequently, and it is genuinely striking. American workers produce significantly more per hour worked than they did in 1968. The productivity gains of the past half-century have been enormous, driven by technological improvement, better management practices, and the increasing complexity of the goods and services that the American economy produces. If the minimum wage had tracked productivity growth since 1968, it would be approximately $24 per hour today. The minimum wage is not $24 per hour. The gap between where the minimum wage is and where it would be if wages had tracked productivity is a measure of the distributional shift that has occurred over the past half-century, in which the returns to productivity growth have been captured primarily by capital and by high-wage workers rather than being distributed across the wage distribution as they were in the post-war decades. This distributional shift is not unique to the minimum wage. It is visible across the entire wage distribution in the growing gap between productivity and compensation that has characterized the American economy since the early 1970s. The minimum wages stagnation is the most visible manifestation of this shift because it is the clearest policy indicator, but it reflects a broader set of changes in the balance of power between labor and capital that have been underway for decades. The political economy of why the minimum wage has stagnated while productivity and prices have risen is the political economy of why the broader wage productivity gap has grown. The decline of union membership, which has reduced labor's political power, the increasing political influence of business interests relative to worker interests, the ideological influence of the economic theory that opposes minimum wage increases, and the specific structural features of the American political system that make it difficult to pass legislation that business interests strongly oppose. Union membership in the private sector has fallen from roughly 35% in the mid-1950s to approximately 6% today. This decline in union membership has reduced organized labor's ability to advocate for minimum wage increases in the same way that it reduced labor's ability to maintain wage increases through collective bargaining. The workers most affected by the minimum wage, low-wage service workers in fast food, retail, home health care, and similar sectors, are also the workers with the lowest union membership rates, the least political organization, and the least access to the political process. The Fight for 15 movement, which began in 2012 with fast food workers in New York demanding a $15 minimum wage, represented an attempt to build the kind of political organizing capacity among low-wage workers that unions had previously provided. The movement achieved significant success at the state and local level, producing minimum wage increases in California, New York, and several other states, as well as in many cities. It did not produce a federal minimum wage increase because the federal legislative process is more difficult to move than state and local processes. The Raise the Wage Act, which would increase the federal minimum wage to $15 per hour, has been introduced in multiple Congresses without passing. The bill passed the House in 2021 but was blocked in the Senate, where the 60-vote threshold for ending debate prevents passage of legislation that faces unified opposition from one party. The business lobby has been effective in maintaining Republican opposition to the bill, and the moderate Democrats who would be needed to override the 60-vote threshold have been reluctant to support a federal minimum wage increase at a level they believe would harm employment in their states. The state-level minimum wage increases that have occurred have provided a significant body of evidence about the effects of minimum wage increases in the range of $10 to $15 per hour. The evidence from these increases has generally been more favorable than opponents predicted. Employment in states that have raised their minimum wages has not declined relative to neighboring states with lower minimum wages. Business closures have not been dramatically higher. The low-wage workers who received the increases have seen meaningful improvements in their earnings. The evidence is not uniformly positive. Some research has found that minimum wage increases have reduced hours worked by low-wage workers, partially offsetting the effect of higher hourly wages. Some research has found negative effects on employment in specific sectors or for specific categories of workers, particularly for younger workers and workers with less than a high school education. The evidence is complex enough that the debate about the employment effects of minimum wage increases has not been fully resolved, though the direction of the most recent research has been more favorable to minimum wage increases than the direction of earlier research. What the evidence does not support is the dramatic job loss predictions that opponents of minimum wage increases have consistently made. The history of minimum wage increases since 1938 is a history of predictions of catastrophe that did not materialize. Each increase in the minimum wage has been accompanied by predictions that businesses would close, that unemployment would rise, that the economy would be damaged. Each increase has been followed by evidence that the predictions were overstated. This pattern is not a reason to dismiss concerns about the employment effects of minimum wage increases entirely. It is a reason to evaluate those concerns empirically rather than accepting them at face value. The empirical record suggests that moderate minimum wage increases, set at levels consistent with the prevailing market wages in the regions where they apply, have small and uncertain employment effects that are typically smaller than their benefits to the workers who receive the increases. The current federal minimum wage of $7.25 per hour is not moderate relative to prevailing wages in high-wage states like California and New York, where it is well below the prevailing market wage. It is significantly below moderate even in low-wage states, where it represents a wage floor that has been eroded by 16 years of inflation. The failure to increase the federal minimum wage since 2009 has produced the longest period of minimum wage stagnation in the law's history, and the workers who have borne the cost of that stagnation are the workers who were already at the bottom of the wage distribution. The woman earning $4 a week in the garment factory in 1933 was earning wages that were catastrophically inadequate by any measure. The worker earning the federal minimum wage in 2025 is earning wages that are inadequate in ways that are less dramatic but no less real. Below the poverty line for a family of any size, insufficient to cover basic living expenses in most American cities, representing a real wage that is worth less than the minimum wage of 1968 despite 60 years of economic growth. The progress from no floor to an inadequate floor is real. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 was a genuine achievement that improved the lives of millions of workers and established the principle that the federal government had both the authority and the obligation to set a minimum standard for the compensation of labor. That principle has been maintained. The floor itself has not been maintained in real terms. The workers who earn it today have less purchasing power than the workers who earned the minimum wage in 1968, in an economy that is vastly more productive than the economy of 1968. That is the measure of what has been lost in the intervening decades, and it is the measure of what a restored commitment to the minimum wage's original purpose would need to recover. Subscribe if this kind of history is what you are here for. There is a great deal more of it ahead. There is a dimension of the minimum wage story that connects the historical origins of the law to the most contentious current debates about its future, and it is the dimension of who the minimum wage is for and whose interests it is designed to serve. The original Fair Labor Standards Act was designed to address the conditions of the lowest-paid industrial workers in the Depression-era economy. The workers it covered were disproportionately women, immigrants, and workers in industries where unions were weak or absent. The workers it excluded, agricultural workers and domestic workers, were disproportionately black. The design of the original law reflected both a genuine concern for the workers it covered and a political accommodation to the racial hierarchy of the New Deal era. The expansion of coverage over the subsequent decades to include agricultural workers in 1966 and domestic workers in 1974 was a gradual recognition that the original exclusions were racial compromises that could not be justified on any other grounds. The extension of coverage to these workers was not accompanied by the same energy of advocacy that had produced the original law, and the minimum wage for agricultural workers remained below the standard minimum wage for years after they were brought under coverage. Today, the workers who are most dependent on the federal minimum wage are not the industrial workers of the Depression era. They are workers in the service sector, fast food workers, retail workers, home health aides, childcare workers, hotel and restaurant workers. These workers are disproportionately women, disproportionately workers of color, and disproportionately workers in sectors where union membership is low and employer market power is high. The overlap between the demographic characteristics of minimum wage workers in 2025 and the demographic characteristics of the workers who were excluded from the original 1938 law is striking and not coincidental. The sectors that employ the most minimum wage workers in 2025 are sectors that were either excluded from the original law or were not significant parts of the economy in 1938. The workers in those sectors face many of the same structural disadvantages that excluded agricultural and domestic workers from coverage in 1938. Limited bargaining power, high employer market power, and limited access to the political process. The home health aide is perhaps the clearest contemporary example. Home health aides, who provide personal care to elderly and disabled people in their homes, are among the lowest paid workers in the American economy. They earn wages that hover near the minimum wage in many states, in jobs that are physically and emotionally demanding, that require genuine skill and care, and that produce services that are essential to the functioning of the healthcare system and to the well-being of the people they care for. The workers who perform this care are overwhelmingly women, overwhelmingly workers of color, and overwhelmingly immigrants. They are among the workers with the least bargaining power in the American labor market, in jobs that are difficult to automate and that cannot be offshored, that require physical presence and human judgment, and that are compensated at rates that make it difficult to attract and retain the workers needed to meet the growing demand for home care as the population ages. The minimum wage floor, where it applies to home health aides, sets a floor that is typically far below what would be required to attract an adequate supply of workers of the quality needed to provide good care. The result is high turnover, inadequate staffing, and quality problems that affect the care received by the elderly and disabled people who depend on these workers. The inadequacy of home health aide wages is simultaneously a problem for the workers who earn them, a problem for the people who receive the care, and a problem for the families who rely on the availability of affordable home care. Raising the minimum wage for home health aides would address the first problem directly and the second and third problems indirectly, by improving the wages in a way that attracts and retains better workers and reduces turnover. The political difficulty is that home care is largely publicly funded through Medicaid, and raising wages for home health aides requires either increasing Medicaid reimbursement rates or reducing provider margins. Both of these require legislative action that is contested by the same political dynamics that have prevented federal minimum wage increases since 2009. The childcare worker faces an analogous situation. Childcare workers, who are essential to the participation of parents in the paid labor force, are among the lowest paid workers in the American economy. The wages of childcare workers are constrained by the same economic logic that constrains all low-wage service workers. The employers who hire them, childcare centers, have limited ability to raise prices because childcare is already unaffordable for many families, and the workers have limited bargaining power because the supply of potential workers is large relative to the demand. The result is a childcare sector that is simultaneously unaffordable for parents and that pays workers wages that are inadequate to attract and retain the people needed to provide quality care. This double squeeze, unaffordable for parents and inadequate for workers, is a product of a system in which the costs of a service that is essential to economic productivity are distributed across low-wage workers and families rather than shared more broadly. A minimum wage increase that applied to childcare workers would address one dimension of this problem, the inadequacy of worker wages, without fully addressing the affordability problem for parents. These examples illustrate a broader point about the minimum wage debate that the economic modeling often misses. The minimum wage debate is not just about the binary question of whether a higher minimum wage produces more or fewer jobs. It is about the distribution of the costs of essential services across different parts of the economy, about who bears the cost of the care and service work that the economy depends on, and about whether the market's distribution of those costs is the right distribution. The market's answer, in the absence of a minimum wage, or with an inadequate one, is to distribute the costs to the workers who perform the work, in the form of wages too low to live on. The workers who accept those wages are not doing so freely in the sense of having chosen from a range of equally good alternatives. They are doing so because the alternatives available to them are worse. The minimum wage is a policy intervention that says the market's answer is not the right answer, that there is a floor below which the compensation of labor should not fall, regardless of what the market would produce. Whether the current federal floor of $7.25 is the right floor, whether $15 is closer to right, whether the right level varies by region in ways that the current uniform federal standard does not capture, are empirical and normative questions that the minimum wage debate has been grappling with since before the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed. What is not a legitimate question is whether a floor should exist at all. The experience of the decades before the minimum wage was established, the $4 weeks and the 9-cent hours and the garment factory workers who could not afford to eat adequately on their wages, established clearly that the market's unregulated answer to the question of what the compensation of labor should be is an inadequate answer for millions of workers. The minimum wage was established to correct this inadequacy. Its adequacy in correcting it is a legitimate question. The legitimacy of the correction itself is settled, from the woman in the New York garment factory in 1933 earning $4 a week, to the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 and the 25-cent floor, to the $7.25 floor that has not moved since 2009, to the home health aide and the child care worker and the fast food worker who earn that floor in 2025, and who are asking, as workers have been asking since before the minimum wage existed, whether the floor is high enough to stand on. That is the history of the minimum wage in America. The floor exists. The question of whether it is adequate has never been fully answered. Subscribe if this kind of history is what you are here for. There is a great deal more of it ahead. The international comparison is worth making here, as it has been worth making in other videos in this series, because the United States is not the only country that has grappled with the minimum wage question, and the comparison reveals something important about how different political and economic systems have answered it. Most wealthy countries have minimum wages that are higher than the United States federal minimum, both in nominal terms and as a percentage of the median wage. The United Kingdom's national living wage, which applies to workers over 23, was raised to £12.21 per hour in April 2024, roughly equivalent to $15 at contemporary exchange rates. Germany introduced a statutory minimum wage in 2015 and has increased it several times, reaching €12.41 per hour in 2024. France has a minimum wage called the SMIC that is indexed to inflation and to productivity, automatically increasing as prices and wages rise. The indexing approach used by France and some other countries is particularly relevant to the American situation. By automatically adjusting the minimum wage to maintain its purchasing power, the SMIC avoids the political battles over periodic increases that have characterized the American minimum wage debate. The floor rises automatically with inflation, and the question of whether to raise it above inflation is a separate political question from the question of maintaining its real value. The United States has not adopted automatic indexing at the federal level, though several states have. The states with automatic indexing, including Washington, Oregon, and Colorado, have seen their minimum wages rise consistently above the federal minimum as inflation has eroded the federal floor. Workers in those states have been partially protected from the 16-year stagnation that has characterized the federal minimum wage, because the state minimum wage has risen with prices even when the federal minimum has not. The political difficulty of adopting automatic indexing at the federal level reflects the same dynamics that have prevented minimum wage increases more generally. Automatic indexing would remove the regular political battle over minimum wage increases, which business interests prefer to fight and occasionally win, in exchange for a system in which the floor is maintained without legislative action. Business interests prefer the current system, in which the floor erodes in real terms during periods of legislative inaction, to a system in which the floor is automatically maintained. The workers who have borne the cost of that preference are the workers at the bottom of the wage distribution, whose real wages have declined over the 16 years since the last federal minimum wage increase, as inflation has eroded the value of the nominal floor they stand on. These are not abstractions. They are specific workers making specific calculations about whether their wages allow them to pay rent, buy food, and meet the other basic expenses of life. A fast food worker in Mississippi earning the federal minimum wage of $7.25 per hour for 40 hours per week earns approximately $15,000 per year before taxes. The federal poverty line for a single person in 2025 is approximately $15,500. The federal minimum wage, for a full-time worker with no dependents, produces income that is below the federal poverty line. For a worker with any dependents, the gap between minimum wage income and the poverty line is larger. This is the situation that the minimum wage was designed to prevent. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 was passed with the explicit goal of eliminating labor conditions detrimental to the maintenance of the minimum standard of living necessary for health, efficiency, and general well-being of workers. A full-time worker earning a wage that puts them below the federal poverty line is not maintaining a minimum standard of living. The law is not achieving its stated purpose at the current federal minimum wage level. Understanding this gap between the law's purpose and its current performance is the foundation for the political argument about what should be done. The argument is not about whether to have a minimum wage. It is about whether the minimum wage should be set at a level that achieves what the law was designed to achieve, a floor sufficient to meet basic living expenses, or at a level that reflects the political balance of power between those who benefit from low wages and those who earn them. The political balance of power has produced the $7.25 floor that has not moved since 2009. Whether it will produce a different answer in the coming years depends on whether the workers who earn the minimum wage and who depend on its adequacy develop the political organization to demand a better answer. The woman in the garment factory in 1933 and the workers who organized around her eventually produced the political pressure for the Fair Labor Standards Act. The fast food workers who launched the Fight for 15 in 2012 produced minimum wage increases in more than half the states. The federal answer has not yet followed. Whether it will and when is the next chapter of this history. Subscribe if you want to keep following it. There is more ahead. The final thread of this history connects the minimum wage to the broader story of what American workers have and have not been able to achieve through the political process, and what the minimum wage's trajectory tells us about the balance of power in that process. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 was a product of a specific political moment, a Democratic supermajority in Congress, a president committed to labor standards legislation, and a labor movement that had grown significantly in political power through the organizing drives of the mid-1930s. The CIO had organized the mass production industries, the steel workers, the auto workers, the rubber workers, in the years between the Wagner Act of 1935 and the passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act, and the political power that this organizing produced was a significant factor in the act's eventual passage. The subsequent history of minimum wage tracks the political strength of organized labor with reasonable accuracy. The increases of the 1940s through 1960s occurred during periods of strong union membership and strong democratic political control. The stagnation of the 1980s and 1990s corresponded to the decline in union membership and the increasing political power of business interests relative to labor. The increases of the late 1990s and 2000s occurred during periods when the erosion of the real minimum wage had become politically embarrassing and when bipartisan support was sufficient to produce increases. The current 16-year stagnation corresponds to a period in which the political dynamics are strongly unfavorable to minimum wage increases at the federal level. Declining union membership, increasing business political power, partisan polarization that makes bipartisan agreement on wage legislation difficult, and a structural feature of the Senate that requires 60 votes to pass legislation that faces unified opposition. Changing this dynamic requires either changing the structural features of the political system, which is itself a long-term political project, or building the political coalitions necessary to produce legislative change within the current structure. The Fight for 15 demonstrated that the second approach can work at the state and local level. The federal level requires building a coalition that can overcome a 60-vote threshold in the Senate, which requires either significant bipartisan support or a change in Senate rules. The political work of building that coalition is the work of the labor movement, of advocacy organizations, and of the workers themselves, who are the constituency that has the most at stake in the outcome. Understanding the history of how the minimum wage was established, what it has achieved, and where it has fallen short is part of that work. The history is longer and more complicated than the simple narrative of steady progress from low wages to adequate wages suggests. It is a history of achievement, compromise, stagnation, and ongoing struggle. The achievement is real. The Fair Labor Standards Act established a wage floor that did not previously exist, and that has protected millions of workers from the most egregious wage exploitation. The compromise is real. The racial exclusions of the original law left the workers most in need of protection outside its coverage for decades. The stagnation is real. The current federal minimum wage has been eroded by 16 years of inflation to a level that does not achieve what the law was designed to achieve. And the struggle is ongoing. Workers, advocates, and legislators are continuing to argue about what the floor should be and what it would take to set it at a level that actually achieves a minimum standard of living for those who work full-time. The woman earning $4 a week in the garment factory in 1933 is the beginning of this story. The fast food worker earning $7.25 an hour in Mississippi in 2025 is somewhere in the middle of it. The end has not yet been written, from the $4 week of 1933 to the 25-cent per hour floor of 1938, to the series of increases through the post-war decades that maintain the real value of the floor, to the erosion that began in the 1980s as the political balance shifted, to the $7.25 floor that has not moved since 2009. To the ongoing argument about what the floor should be and who should set it. That is the history of the minimum wage in America. The floor exists, it is not high enough. And the argument about how high it should be is as unresolved as it has been at any point in the law's 87-year history. Subscribe if this kind of history is what you are here for. There is a great deal more of it ahead. One final observation before we close, and it is an observation about what the minimum wage debate reveals about the relationship between economics and politics in the American system. The economic debate about the minimum wage has been conducted at an increasingly sophisticated level since the Card and Kruger research of the early 1990s challenged the simple supply and demand model. The empirical literature has grown substantially, the methodology has improved, and the range of evidence available to inform the debate has expanded significantly. The current state of the economic evidence is more nuanced than it was in 1938, more nuanced than it was in 1968, and more nuanced than it was in 1993. What has not kept pace with the sophistication of the economic debate is the political outcome. The federal minimum wage in 2025 is not set at a level that reflects the best available economic evidence about what level would maximize worker welfare while minimizing employment effects. It is set at the level that the political process has been able to produce, which reflects the balance of political power between those who benefit from low wages and those who earn them, much more than it reflects the state of the economic evidence. This is not unique to the minimum wage. It is characteristic of most policy areas where there is a clear distributional conflict between groups with different levels of political power. The group with more political power, which in the minimum wage case is the business community, tends to produce policy outcomes more consistent with its interests than the economic evidence would support. The group with less political power, which in the minimum wage case is low-wage workers, tends to receive policy outcomes that are less favorable than the economic evidence would justify. Understanding this political economy is not the same as accepting it. It is the foundation for understanding what it would take to change it. The minimum wage is set where it is because of the political choices that have been made over the past 16 years. Different political choices are available. Making them requires building the political power necessary to overcome the resistance of those who benefit from the current level. That political power is built through organizing, through advocacy, through the electoral choices of the workers who have the most at stake in the outcome, and through the cultural and political work of making the inadequacy of the current minimum wage as visible and as politically costly as the inadequacy of no minimum wage was in 1938. The woman in the garment factory in 1933 was part of a political moment that eventually produced change. The fast food workers who launched the Fight for 15 in 2012 were part of a political moment that produced state-level change. The federal change has not yet come. Whether it will, and when, depends on whether the political moment that produces it can be built. That is the open question at the end of this history, not whether a minimum wage should exist. That question was settled in 1938. The question of whether the minimum wage should be adequate to achieve what it was designed to achieve is the question that remains. Subscribe if you want to keep following this kind of history. There is more ahead.